Hey, you're watching my official compilation channel, but if you want to see my newest videos as soon as they're uploaded, check out my main channel, Chat History. Alright, enjoy the video. So you really like serial killers, huh? Alright, well, here's some that you've probably never heard of. Ow. Now, when you think of the term serial killer, you probably wiggle your brain towards figures like Jack the Ripper, Ted Bundy, or even Jonathan Wayne Gacy. But everyone knows about those guys. History has a myriad of murderers that have remained out of the spotlight. After all, humans have been going at each other in silly squabbles since the dawn of man. I say, your cock is bigger than mine. How about you? Oh, you dumb bitch. But first, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is a serial killer? Well, according to the FBI, the definition has shifted its criteria across the years, with differing requirements for the number of victims, motives, and all that jazz. But the current definition as it stands is someone who forces at least 3 people to cash in their life insurance policies in 3 separate times or locations, often with a cooling or premeditation period in between. So with that out of the way, our first creature that meets this criteria is one Ana de Pistoia, more well known as Baba Anyoika. She was a truly withering wicked witch back in the days of Yugoslavia, but before she was just a walking wrinkle, she was a babe in her heyday. Probably. But after an unfortunate encounter with an Austrian stud muffin who left her destitute, devastated, and diseased at the age of 20, young Anna became reclusive, finding solace in the study of medicine and chemistry. She became quickly consumed in the world of medical treatments, both conventional and homeopathic. But after years of preparing potions and lotions in solitude, Anna's father stepped in and offered some advice. Medicine good, but baby is better. Go make a baby. Many baby. And so, Anna was married off to a wealthy bachelor. A much older wealthy bachelor. But the old geezer was still able to please her, or at least achieve the biological functions required to put a baby in her belly. 11 times. But since their genetic material seemed to be made out of a wet tissue paper, 10 of the 11 children crossed over into the shadow realm before even reaching adulthood, with Anna's husband trailing behind shortly after. With those eventful 20 years of her life shrinking into the distance of her rearview mirror, Anna returned to her studies, setting up her own chemistry lab in her now inherited estate. She gained a reputation as a healer and herbalist in the local village, providing syrups, serums, and solutions to anyone in need. She could fix coughs and colds or mend bumps and bruises. This reputation gave her the name Baba Anyoika, as she was seen as the caring grandmother of the village. Her services did make her a pretty penny, enough to pay the bills and live a comfortable life. But getting on in her years in the 1920s, the 80-year-old reclusive woman's ambitions took a dark turn. She began to notice a pattern. Many of her returning customers were younger women that were victims of their marriages or their families. These women would confide in Anna about their experiences and their traumas. So she offered a new product. A small swill of magic water that would fix their problem. This potion contained traces of arsenic and other undetectable plant toxins that, when administered to the unknowing victims, would cause them to succumb to a slow death, usually passing within a week or 2. While conversing with any interested customers, she would gather pertinent information such as height and weight so she could calculate a proper dosage. But of course, this service wasn't free. A single potion could run you between 2,000 to 10,000 Yugoslav dinars, or roughly $600 to $3,000 in today's money. But if you were desperate enough, your life savings could save your life. It is estimated that between 50 to 150 men died as a direct result of Baba Anyoika's magic water. Now, when there's a bunch of husbands dropping like flies around a village, things are gonna get suspicious. A few of the wives were interrogated, but no one would fess up to any crime. It wasn't until 1926 that things would turn sour. After selling a swig of the magic water to a husband and wife who were desperate to, and succeeded in ridding themselves of an erratic, cruel, and mega wealthy family member, the police finally stepped in. Once a rich dude dies, then it's serious. The living members were arrested and interrogated until, finally, the wife caved and outed the unassuming Shaky Sr. as the mastermind behind all of the village's mysterious deaths. Anna was all, but the testifying defendants retaliated with a resounding, yeah, huh. Many of the village's new widows claimed they had no knowledge of the poison within the potions, and that instead, the old woman used black magic to kill them from afar. The now 91-year-old Baba Anyoika was formally arrested in 1929 and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, or whatever hard labor the dusty old bitch could even perform. She was released just 8 years later at age 99 due to her very obviously blinking health bar. She died shortly after her 100th birthday in 1938. If there's a way to game a system, you can bet your fat tits that the scummiest of the scum will find ways to take advantage of it. Next on our list is Amelia Dyer, one of the UK's most infamous serial killers and one despicable excuse for a human being. And you've probably never heard of her. Back in the day in 1800s Great Britain, unmarried mothers kind of got shafted by the government after getting shafted by their partners. You see, in 1834, the British government struggled to keep up with the ongoing costs of feeding and housing the lower class. So the government, acting like the toilet that it was, decided to make that shit someone else's problem. It passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, a piece of legislature that completely overhauled the poverty relief system. It ultimately halted any government assistance to poor people who were still deemed physically able to work. Only those who were otherwise incapable of work due to physical disability or old age qualified for financial relief. This act was proposed after identifying innumerable abuses of the old system, with taxpayer pounds going to individuals who treated it as a way of life rather than a temporary safety net. The entire thing was just a big ol' nudge, encouraging any able-bodied poor to get to earning their keep or, well, die. This hit especially hard for the demographic of poor women who bore illegitimate children. Baby daddies were now off the hook for child support, and these moms were now faced with an impossible choice: either go to work to survive or stay home with the children and starve. But this is where another industry began to take root: baby farming. You mean like cute itty-bitty babies sprouting from the earth? No, that's not how that works, pat pat pat. But these babies would end up in the ground. With loads of single mothers forced to work to barely scrape by and workhouses having a strict "don't bring your child to work" policy, many of these mothers opted for adoption in hopes that their children would be better cared for with a loving family or otherwise hospitable environment. And some of those did in fact exist, but others weren't so generous.
Please, sir, I want some more.
Baby farms were the last resort. These desperate mothers could have their child taken off of their hands, no questions asked, for a hefty one-time fee. In exchange, the little one would be fed, clothed, and provided shelter. Or at least, that was the hope. The harsh reality, though, was that some of these baby farms were a place of cruelty and torture. And this is where Amelia Dyer comes in. She was the ringleader of such an establishment. A widow, a mother, and a trained nurse, Amelia turned to baby farming as a way to keep the candles on at night and a few biscuits on the table. And to her credit, she did initially provide legitimate care for the trembling little tykes. She actually had a long history as a caregiver, being responsible for her mentally ill mother when she was a child. But this responsibility and exposure to mental illness at such a young age took an apathetic toll on her, one that would fester and eventually manifest itself down the road, right about the time that she had a healthy supply of tumbling toddlers teetering around. And that's when the deaths started. Many of the children that she took in began Final Fantasy fading away from various forms of neglect or starvation. But this was all part of the plan. One less child is one less mouth to feed and one less financial burden to bear. After all, the payment was already received, so anything after that is just opportunity cost. Beginning her baby farm in 1869, it took 10 years before anyone became suspicious of her shady business plan. Local doctors took notice to the alarming number of deaths under her care and decided to intervene. Dyer was charged with neglect and sentenced to just 6 months of hard labor, with any remaining children taken from her care. But that wouldn't stop her. Shortly after her release and a few spells in a mental facility, Amelia waddled off to Reading to start from scratch, and it wouldn't be long before she refilled her inventory of children. Only this time, things would be more deliberate and precise. She placed advertisements in the newspaper under a false name and narrative, claiming to be a loving couple who wanted nothing more than to provide a life of love and comfort to a child they could never bear. And many took the bait. Now, this next part gets a little rough, so here's your warning. Almost immediately after receiving payment from unwitting mothers or parents, Amelia Dyer would systematically snuff out the light of these innocent lives. The quicker the end, the more profit for her. It was reported that she would starve, neglect, or strangle her victims, often with a unique seamstress's white tape that became her signature. She was later quoted saying, "I used to like to watch them with the tape around their neck, but it was soon all over with them." Not wanting to involve doctors to issue any death certificates like last time, especially since these were due to very obviously unnatural causes, Amelia took matters into her own hands. She would dispose of the bodies by boxing them up tight and hucking them in the River Thames, a system that would keep her secret hidden, but would ultimately lead to her undoing. In 1896, a package was discovered along the banks of the Thames by a local bargeman. Out of curiosity, he eagerly explored its contents, but was struck with horror. The package contained the body of an infant girl and a few bricks that failed in weighing the container down. The police were called and they swarmed in to investigate. A local detective was able to identify faint, legible writing which pointed the police towards Amelia's home. One justifiable home raid later, and mountains of evidence were uncovered linking Amelia to her crimes. These were adoption telegrams, pawn shop tickets for when she sold off the children's clothing, as well as numerous unanswered letters from worried mothers, all enveloped in a stench of decaying remains. Amelia Dyer was formally arrested on April 4th, 1896, and the jury did not mess around. They came back with a unanimous guilty verdict in just 4.5 minutes.
Will the jury find the defendant guilty as fuck?
The combination of the insurmountable evidence gathered from her home and the rate at which she carried out her evil deeds have convinced experts on the matter that Amelia was responsible for the deaths of up to 400 children over the course of 30 years, making her one of history's most prolific serial killers. For her crimes, Amelia Dyer was hanged on June 10th, 1896, at the age of 58. Hey, want to see a subliminal message? Alright, this story actually begins where it ends with the publication of this pamphlet in 1654. This is a criminal pamphlet, sort of the precursor to modern true crime documentaries. These pamphlets would outline the life and crimes of the most notorious criminals of the age. Their original purpose was to serve as a sort of moral instruction, to give the average person a glimpse into the mind of a deranged and troubled criminal. But it actually turned out to be a form of entertainment as people became fascinated with learning about those who would defect from morality. Crazy how some things never change. This profound puddle of piss currently in the center of your screen is one Melchior Hedloff, the self-confessed Polish-Lithuanian serial killer hailing from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, some claim his crimes to be a bit of a stretch, but we'll tear into that later. It was here in the city of Wrocław that Hedloff would make his skid mark on history's britches. According to this pamphlet, which seems to be one of the few surviving records of his life, Mini Melky reverse Gaussian blurred into this world as a poor peasant with not a penny to his name. Being a boy of limited financial means, with a papa who was always sick and a mama who was always working, Melchior fled from home and found himself amongst a dodgy division of delinquents for survival. He would join various mercenary groups roaming the countryside after the 30 Years' War, which utterly devastated the region and just threw everything into chaos. It was within these groups that he learned the art of ambushing, the competence of combat, and the forte of firearms. With all of these brand spanking new skills in his repertoire, he turned to a life of crime as mercenary work started to die down. He became what is known as a highwayman, robbers that would lie in wait along isolated roads for any unsuspecting travelers. You see, back then, especially in unstable times like say immediately after a giant war, areas between towns were relatively lawless, and you were on your own to protect yourself as well as your belongings or your loved ones. Once a potential victim was spotted, they would leap out from behind a tree or something to jump scare you, potentially prompting you to pop out a retaliatory pine cone.
Give me all your money! Oh my fucking god.
You were actually considered lucky if a local bandito took the time to threaten you for your belongings, because most robbers, like Melchior, were not so merciful. Instead, he would position himself behind cover and just stab travelers from a distance with a bullet, carving a notch in his rifle for each victim claimed. He would then loot the bodies and hide them away from the road to avoid any suspicion. This worked for a while to fill his pockets with coin and to slake his thirst for violence, but Hedloff soon entered one of the most dangerous states of mind for a serial killer: boredom. The thrill of just blasting people away and stealing their stuff soon became stale, and since variety is the spice of life, he decided to season the shit out of his future crimes. All of this hit an apex with his most infamous crime. According to this pamphlet, Hedloff had crossed paths with a young pregnant woman traveling the roads. Allured by the jingle-jangle of her coin purse, he offered to provide protection for the woman on her travels lest, some rapscallions decide to mug her and leave her for dead. She agreed. The two proceeded down the path until reaching an inn to lodge for the night.
Good night.
Good night. Hedloff strangled the poor woman, but he wasn't finished. He managed to take the body from the inn to hide his crime. Next to a nearby pond, Hedloff allegedly cut into his victim using his sword and yanked out the miniature unborn child, gobbling it up like a gummy bear. Now, before you say, there's no way that's true. You might be right, but you may be wrong. Why? Because the details in Melchior's crime pamphlet came from Melchior himself, albeit through tortured confessions. After years of causing chaos on the highways, he gained a reputation, and locals were not having it. He was eventually arrested after evading capture for some time, and since he was found with incriminating evidence already linking him to several recent crimes, the townsfolk already knew he was guilty, and other eyewitnesses confirmed it. In 1654, Melchior Hedloff was sentenced to be drawn and quartered, but not before confessing to over 200 murders as he was being tortured. Those confessions were then fabricated into this elaborate and sensational pamphlet. Sure, some of it may have been the over-exaggerated ramblings of a doomed man karmically getting his tummy torn into, but that's just good storytelling. Oh boy, Peter Niersch. If you've never heard of this guy before, you soon will, as is the point of this video. Peter terrorized the German countryside in the 16th century. He was often described as demonic, having been accused of dabbling in black magic and dark sorcery. He began his young adult life as a shepherd, but feeling sheer sheepishness from his lackluster career, he heard of better opportunities abroad, but would later find himself on the lam. Like Hedloff's story, Germany at the time, within the Holy Roman Empire, was a land of opportunity, not for the righteous and honorable, but for the lowly and treacherous. This was because Peter lived in the aftermath of the German Peasants' War, a political uprising of peasants that was quickly stamped out by the upper aristocrats, resulting in over 100,000 lower-class deaths. Resentment for the upper class had boiled over, but the impoverished were proven to be powerless against them. Being born into poverty himself, Peter knew that it was nearly impossible to shake off the shackles of the lower class. So he had to take matters into his own hands, even if it meant cutting a few throats along the way. Ditching his shepherd's staff for something a bit more pointy around 1566, Peter joined up with bandits and thugs, pillaging villages and tormenting towns. But he soon found himself rising in the ranks and becoming the main mugger in charge. Together, Peter and his band of highwaymen would ransack the countryside, robbing any travelers along the roads of the Holy Roman Empire. But he would soon get too carried away with his crimes. Peter, I think he's dead. You can stop stabbing now.
Just let him go.
But he... It wasn't until 11 years later in 1577 that Peter met with any sort of justice, but only momentarily. He was formally arrested, but managed to give the authorities the slip, fading into darkness once more. His reported crimes and evasiveness gave him quite the reputation. Remember that pamphlet from the last chapter? Well, Peter had his own, and it was much more fantastical. Although the tales contained many real aspects of his misdeeds, they were also vastly exaggerated, telling of Peter's deal with the devil, his diving into the depths of black magic, and even his supernatural ability to shapeshift into dark beasts. It was said that he harvested the hearts of unborn children to cast curses or make himself invisible. Although obviously outlandish, the true root of these claims could be rationalized. His shapeshifting and ability to become invisible is attributed to his incredible skills of disguise and evasiveness. Despite his numerous crimes, he could never seem to be caught, or at least remain caught. His actions gave him widespread notoriety, which would actually be his downfall. One night in September of 1581, after stopping in a local bathhouse, the weary Peter just wanted to soak his sack in peace. He left his belongings with the owner of the bathhouse for safekeeping, as was the norm. But Peter was unknowingly drawing attention, with some other patrons recognizing the man that was bathing his balls in bliss before them. Curious, a few men snuck over to Peter's traveling bag and opened it, as it was also said to contain his dark magic tools. But the men were soon horror-struck with what they found inside: several severed heads and multiple hearts. Although stunned, they quickly apprehended Peter, and he confessed to his crimes. Peter Niersch was formally arrested and tortured over the course of 3 days in the town of Neumarkt, being broken on the wheel. It is said that the heavy wooden wheel was slammed onto him 42 times. Breakfast? Wheel. Lunch? Wheel. Dinner? Have a hearty beef Wheelington. All of this bashing from the wheel basically rendered the man down to a battered blob, but he was somehow still alive. Don't worry, they had a solution. Peter was quartered. Through his various confessions while getting dunked on by a wheel, Peter Niersch was reportedly responsible for 544 deaths, including 24 pregnant women and their unborn children. He was pulled apart by the people at age 41. The most painful punishments from around the world. Well, of course the Spaniards are going to be on this list. Them suckers tortured half-truths out of people for over 350 years during the highly unexpected Spanish Inquisition between 1478 up until 1834. Now, when you're performing painful public persecutions for such a long time, you're going to come up with pretty colorful ways to do it. Ways to inflict maximum pain to ensure that you extract those dubious confessions from those filthy non-Catholic heathens. So it's no wonder that history was blessed with devilish devices designed to do just that. You had the Spanish spider, the Spanish collar, the Spanish tickler, very different from the French variety, the Spanish donkey, and the star of this segment, the Spanish boot. Originating somewhere during the Inquisition times, the Spanish boot was a very basic, yet very effective interrogation tool. Help. 4 planks of wood and a few bits of metal. You got your braces for holding the wooden splints and sharpened metal nails to make you squint. The legs of the victim would be secured in place between the 2 inner free-moving braces. The 2 outer planks are secured to each other, preventing any outward movement. Not that you would want to, because, you know, sharp nails and such. Once the victim was sat down, a large wooden wedge would be placed in between the inner planks, locking the victim's legs. And I'm sure your imagination is a few steps ahead here. The interrogator equips his iconic giant hammer and rears back, preparing to strike. Are you sure you don't want to confess your crimes? Because this pulsating sack of meat is about to treat you like one of them carnival tests of strength. With one swift blow from the hammer, the wedge drives the inner boards outwards, lacerating your legs, shattering your shins, and crushing your calves. The pain is pure agony. And that was only the first strike. Additional slams from the mallet reduce your legs down to something resembling burger meat. Remember when you could walk like 30 seconds ago? Yeah, me too. Now, despite the Iberian identity, there were many variations of the Spanish boot throughout history. The Scottish first dabbled in boot torture even before the Spanish, tightly binding victims' legs in saturated leather. The bindings would then be heated over an open fire, shrinking the leather and constricting the legs to the point of snapping bone. The French even got in on the action with their own version. The victim would be bound and gagged on a wooden chair with both feet placed in a single oversized iron boot. It would then be filled with either boiling water, boiling oil, or even molten lead. And if you're unaware, pure lead melts at around 622 degrees Fahrenheit or 328 degrees Celsius. For comparison, just 2 seconds of exposure to 150 degree Fahrenheit water is enough to cause third-degree burns on human skin. Victims of the French boot would have their skin and their muscles boiled off of their bones or encased in a big hunk of lead. Better get to confessing, or at least make up something convincing. Oh, this shit sucks. You ever hear the term an eye for an eye? Well, the literal form of this would be the toe-curling, face-scrunching practice of abacination. Popular amongst ancient Greeks, Persians, and within the Byzantine Empire, abacination is a form of corporal punishment, meaning that the goal isn't death, but rather to teach the victim a lesson. In this case, how not to see anymore. That's because abacination is the act of inflicting intentional or oftentimes irreversible damage to one's eyeballs. Hey. What the fuck? Your bulbous oculi have a myriad of nerves ready to send your brain big ouch signals the moment they detect discomfort. And boy, are they about to feel some discomfort. Although it was mainly used as a punishment for heresy or treason, the act of annihilating one's eyes existed all across human history. Perhaps one of the most popular examples of this was executed by Byzantine Emperor Basil II. After defeating the Bulgarians at the Battle of Cladion, Big Bad Basil had taken thousands of enemy soldiers hostage. He had ordered that the men be divided into groups of 100 and brought before him. It was then he had his men gouge out the eyes of 99 of the soldiers, sparing one who would be allowed to keep one eye. That lucky duck would be the one to lead his now blinded comrades back to their respective commanders. Now, according to legend, this mass blinding was conducted on 15,000 men, granting Basil II the vicious title of Basil the Bulgar Slayer. But how would this blinding actually be performed? Well, it's really up to how the person doing it felt that day. Traditionally, a bassination was carried out by jamming a red-hot iron rod into the ocular cavity, essentially melting the eye from the skull. Other flavors of removal included scooping with a spoon-like device, slitting with a blade, using preposterous pressure to pop them like pimples, or just leaving it up to good old chemistry. Now, if you really pissed someone off, you would be strapped to a chair while corrosive liquid, usually boiling vinegar, was placed in soluble cups and positioned over your eyes. The corrosive agents would slowly eat away at the bottom of the cups, left to drip into your eyeballs, which would painfully dissolve away. At that point, you'd be luckier to die than to survive.
But couldn't they just close their eyelids?
Oh, you mean these? Yeah, they cut those off too. Don't worry, it was only a little painful. See what I did there? No, you didn't. That's fine. Strap in for this one, cause that's exactly what's about to go down, and your legs are about to go up. This is the Tiger Bench, a Chinese torture device popularly used in China from the Imperial Age up through today. That's right, the International Society for Human Rights, a German-based non-governmental non-profit organization, claims that multiple inhumane torture devices like the Tiger Bench are still used on prisoners in China to this day for extracting confessions or flat-out torture just because. It's true, probably. And the same applied to its use in the Imperial Age. During the times of the Ming and Qing dynasties between the 14th and 20th centuries, the judicial system required a confession to legally convict a criminal for their crimes, since forensics at the time weren't all that great. Unless you had notable status to sway public opinion, the perpetrator would basically have to be caught red-handed by multiple witnesses. He ran into my knife. He ran into my knife 10 times. He had it coming. But what do Tiger Bench do, you ask in poor English? It's very simple. The victim is delicately slammed onto a wooden bench in a sitting position, their hands and ankles bound by ropes, and their mouths gagged with, I don't know, probably a piece of cloth or something. They would also have their torso and thighs secured to the bench to prevent any unwanted thrashing from the pain that they're about to experience. One by one, bricks or wooden slabs would be placed under the victim's piggies, slowly elevating them higher and higher while the rest of their body remained locked in place. Now, unless you have the tibio-tailor talent of a turkey, you can see where this is going. With each addition of a brick, your ligaments in your knees become hyperextended, painfully forcing your knee joint beyond its natural range of motion. If any of you less than limber people remember the ungodly sit and reach box from your middle school gym classes, just imagine that, but someone grabbing your arms and pulling you with all of their might. Then you might just get a lick of what that pain must feel like. The continuous hyperextension eventually leads to the shattering of the kneecaps and the splintering of the leg bones, utterly destroying muscles and tendons, rendering the victim's legs completely useless. Trust me, although this guy seems untroubled, inside, he's screaming. And if that weren't enough, prisoners would be bound in this position for days on end, to the brink of starvation and full sleep deprivation from the ongoing pain. Not only from the hyperextension, but from physical beatings to the rest of their body if they continue to refuse to confess. They don't know I'm a double-jointed masochist. Despite what the chill demeanors on these fellas' faces express, getting sawn vertically in half is not a pleasant experience. Although the act of sawing has been present throughout many different cultures in history, ancient Roman and Chinese versions were mainly done transversely, or at the waist. But some sadistic buttholes thought, nah, not painful enough. Let's try a different axis. And you know what? Let's hang him upside down too. We'll start shredding the sack, split the crack, go down the hull and to the skull. The method is pretty self-explanatory. A victim will be hoisted up upside down with arms and legs secured to 2 posts, usually with their dangly bits out. The condemned would then have a big ol' saw ripped through their bodies like a slice of birthday cake. On the bright side, the poor soul would most likely be long dead or at the very least unconscious before the saw ever got that far, thanks to the excruciating pain and severe blood loss. Documented cases of this particular path of punishment are rare, but some stories have survived. The most known case being that of Simon the Zealot, one of the 12 apostles of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. If you've ever seen Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, he's the less detailed guy all the way at the end of the table getting ridiculed by these 2 fine gents for asking, "When can we eat?" Very little is known about poor Simon at all, being only passively mentioned in the Bible. History states that he preached across Egypt and Persia, with the latter being the place of his demise. Apparently, the Persians weren't too happy with the door-to-door preachings of Simon, so much so that they saw to his end. Literally. According to some historians, around the year 65 AD, at the age of 60, Simon was spread in 2 while spreading the word of the Lord. For his dedication to the J-Man, Simon was made a saint in the Catholic Church, with many depictions of him holding a long saw, similar to the one that ripped through his being. Ironically enough, he was also made the patron saint of tanners and sawyers, which really sucks. I mean, imagine the way you died being your eternal legacy. Like, oh damn guys, you hear that Peter got nailed by a 37 Nissan Altima last week? Better make him the patron saint of pedestrians. But hey, when you walk with Jesus, we're all jaywalkers. Oftentimes we find that nature is already well equipped with possible torture resources, and it doesn't even have to be something large or intimidating. Sometimes it's the small things that pack the biggest punch. Well, turns out that quite a few groups of people around the world took advantage of nature's blessings. Like this little guy. This is a Pseudomyrmex triplarinus, but you can call it a little ouch. This agonizing arthropod is a venomous species of ant most commonly found in the northern areas of South America. These ants contain a cytotoxic venom, which if you remember my little toxins rhyme from my worst jobs in history video, you'd know that cytotoxins cause extreme cellular damage and painful swelling, making it a perfect tool for devastating torture. For this section, we actually have a very modern use case. Back in 2014, a group of Bolivian villagers in the province of Ayopaya apprehended a pair of teenagers accused of stealing several motorcycles. Since the run-of-the-mill judicial penal system wasn't deemed effective enough, the villagers took matters into their own hands. The 2 upstanding criminals, aged 18 and 19, were strapped to a tree infested with venomous ants for 3 days. The young men writhed in pain for hours and hours on end, sustaining bites all over their bodies from head to toe. Chests were chomped, calves were crunched, nipples were nipped, and balls were bitten. It was only after being found by one of their sisters that the young men were freed from their pincer prison. Well, also after all of their relatives coughed up about $3,700 in cash as compensation for the bikes that were stolen. Gotta pay back your debt after all. Both men were rushed to intensive care, with one requiring dialysis to survive. But I bet they learned a valuable lesson. Don't take shit that doesn't belong to you. There have been other claims of ant torture throughout history, though, as a warning, these are more anecdotal than confirmed. It is said that the Apache people of the southern US and northern Mexico regions were capable of committing horrible acts of violence, but hey, when you're forced off your land, what are you gonna do? One such act was taking prisoners of war and burying them neck deep in the earth, allegedly near anthills containing red harvester ants. With a simple prod to the hill, thousands of ants pour out to defend their home, and being the nearest target, looks like you're the culprit. The red harvester ant latches onto your skin with its strong chad-like mandibles and proceeds to repeatedly stab you with its stinger. Once stung, pheromones are released, chemically signaling other ants to swarm you. Your lips, your mouth, your ears, and even your eyes are all susceptible to the stings. The intense pain from just a single sting has been described as feeling like being prodded by a searing hot needle, lasting up to 8 hours. So it goes without saying that thousands of those would really suck. But don't worry, it's well documented that around 500 stings would be enough to kill a human. You're probably getting all itchy just thinking about them things crawling all over you, aren't you? Well, now you are. Our last stop on this journey takes place in the big old continent of Africa. Having dealt with colonization for centuries, the many countries of Africa are no stranger to pain. In fact, they're pretty good at dishing it out, especially to each other. Now, the concept of trial by ordeal is not exclusive to Africa. It's been seen across Europe, Persia, India, and Cambodia as well, but this segment focuses on Africa. Why? Because that's how I wrote the script and that's how I'm editing this video, so okay, so the idea behind the trial by ordeal is to determine the guilt or innocence of the accused through various means of torture. If you survive, you're innocent. If you die, you're guilty. Not that it mattered anymore, but there were many different ordeals to be trialed through. These are gonna be a bit rapid fire, so stick with me. And speaking of which, the first one is the trial by fire. The accused would either be forced to walk along a length of hot coals, hold scalding hot metal, or retrieve items from cauldrons of boiling hot oil. If the victim showed no visible signs of injury, they would be considered innocent. But that's just setting people up for failure. These examples of trial by fire have been historically documented across Togo, Nigeria, and Sudan. Next was the self-explanatory trial by poison. The accused would drink toxic concoctions consisting of various local poisons. In Liberia and Ghana, victims enduring the trial would be forced to ingest the bark of the sassywood tree. Alright, which one of you drank all the sassywood juice?
I
I don't want to drink that stuff. Nope.
Was it you?
The bark of the sassywood tree contains erythroflein, a powerful poison that can fuck up your heart. But as long as you regurgitate that slop out of your system, you're right as rain, and considered innocent. Similarly, some prisoners in Sierra Leone or Nigeria would drink a solution made from the calabar bean which contains physostigmine, an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor. If you've never seen my chemical weapons video, this is just a fancy way of saying that it causes life-threatening seizures and a loss of your respiratory control, causing you to choke to death. One final trial would be the trial by water. Popular in pre-colonial Côte d'Ivoire, the accused would have their hands and feet bound and be tossed in the local river. Those who were able to break free of their bindings and swim to the surface were absolved of their crimes, while those who sank like stones were doomed to figuratively and literally drown in their guilt. Talk about washing away your sins. Yeah, that witch is becoming a real problem. This time, you've been sent into ancient Greece, specifically the classical era. A time of great war and conflict, but also a remarkable leap forward in human civilization. So, can you survive one of humanity's greatest expansions? Or will ancient Greece thermop the floor with you? Let's find out. Greece's classical period began in 510 BC when Athens fell and broke its Hippias, and ended in 323 BC when Alexander was no longer great. As an act of kindness, you've been sent to the funny year. But there's nothing funny about needing to survive. The first thing you need to do is dust yourself off and get your bearings. Maybe a sign or something will help. Well, that's no use. You quickly recall your vast knowledge acquired from countless hours on GeoGuessr and look around for some notable landmarks. After all, some of these buildings still exist in the modern day. Well, there's a familiar sight right over there on the horizon. The Acropolis of Athens. That's in Athens. I must be in Athens. Well, now you know where you are, which means you can start figuring out your next steps for survival. Oops. But first, you need someone to talk to because you're gonna need help. There's never any shame in asking for help. That guy over there seems friendly enough. Although shorter, the dude is absolutely ripped from his labor-intensive chores and looks like he could kill you in one punch, but you approach him anyway. Told you. Now let's assume he's a bit more approachable this time. You begin to ask him a question, but like a monolingual American, you always forget that there are other languages out there besides the freedom one. But you try your best. Here it goes. Hey man, can you help me out here? The man turns his chiseled jaw your way and begins to speak, quickly bombarding you with a bunch of indiscernible mouth sounds that completely fry your brain. But luckily, the words have been displayed in a big old bubble next to his head. Look at all them silly letters. Wait a minute, you say, scratching your chin. I've seen these letters before. Just then, you get a flashback to your college girlfriend's sorority dorm where you found the Euclidean letters, just as you were finding Herclidean. Don't kid yourself. You were doing math homework, you goober. Unfortunately, you come to the realization that knowing just a few letters doesn't mean jack shit in terms of understanding a whole language. Now, some of you modern Greeks out there might lift your hairy arms and say, Ha! I can speak Greek. I'd survive. Well, you're wrong. Ancient Greek is completely different from modern Greek, with completely different tones, vocal inflections, and pronunciations across several regional dialects. Ancient Greeks wouldn't understand a word of modern Greek, so you'd have no real advantage. Needless to say, you're not going to be communicating anytime soon, at least not orally. You begin attempting some charades as a way to express your needs. Too bad all of your wacky waving is perceived as a threat. Man, that's twice. Since you just insulted a random citizen and are an obvious outsider, you're arrested and sold into slavery. Looks like you've been slammed to the bottom of the societal barrel. But what did you expect? Speaking of society, like any society in history, ancient Greece operated under a hierarchy. Since you just got dunked into classical Athens, let's focus on that. Here, there were 4 main groups. The upper class were the elite, the cream of the crop, and we all know that the cream rises to the top. To be a part of the upper class was a birthright. You must have been born in Athens to a moderately or highly wealthy family and be well educated. And a guy. The members of this class were the only ones that held any political power and the only ones classified as citizens. That being the case, the upper class controlled all social and economic policies as well as law. As a democracy, 500 citizens were chosen at random each year to run the government, given complete control over the proposal of new policies and laws. Kind of like an oligarchy. These policies were either accepted or rejected by popular vote. Next was the middle class. Usually referred to as the medics, they were all the dudes who weren't born in Athens but still lived there. Foreign skilled laborers such as craftsmen, merchants, and artists. These guys built ships, constructed buildings, and kept the city maintained. Sure, they didn't have a lot of rights like the ability to own land or vote in governmental affairs, but they were the core of the Greek economy. You know, a thing that barely exists today. Oh yeah, women were also part of the middle class. Not many rights outside of being in charge of the house and raising the kids. Ancient Greek society wasn't too fair to women. The lower class, or the freedmen, were exactly who you think they were. Come on, it's right there in the name. They were freed men, former slaves who bought their own freedom through intensive labor and saving. They pulled themselves up by their sandal straps and worked hard their whole life, only to have little to no rights or place in society. But hey, at least they aren't smelly slaves anymore. Slaves were lower than dirt in the societal hierarchy and weren't even considered a class. They were usually captured prisoners of war or purchased from former traders. Slaves were either owned by families as house servants or by the government outright for general labor, which came in all kinds of flavors. Farmers, bankers, soldiers, employed friends with benefits, police, all kinds of stuff. Imagine being arrested by a slave. Sir, you have the right to remain silent. Huh, well, at least I have rights. Slaves made up about 1/3 of the population and were an absolute goldmine for their owners. Profit margins are pretty healthy when you don't have to pay them much. Or at all. Speaking of gold mines, that's where you're headed. Time to get branded and get a move on. You're swiftly carted off to join a group of miners so large it would cause a YouTube elite to start sweating. Oh man, looks like all the cool slaves have been sent to the surface mine to get gold and silver. But since your mining level sucks, you get to go underground for some cuprum. That's copper. Working in a mine was brutal. Slaves were subjected to intense labor all day, working in poorly ventilated and swelteringly hot cave systems hundreds of feet deep in the earth, illuminated only by dim oil lamps. You can't see shit, which means your fellow slaves can't see jack shit, so watch out for rogue pickaxes. You toil away day in and day out for a while now, but notice that, like the rock around you, you're getting chiseled. The combination of your new Mediterranean diet and constant physical exertion is starting to pay off. You're able to mine more efficiently, and you're outperforming your coworkers. Thanks to all of your hard work and dedication, the local mine supervisor rewards you with more backbreaking work. Looks like you gotta add your pride to the list of things getting crushed around these parts. You're working hard and gaining some gains, but you need to start finding a way out of here soon. You see, the life expectancy for miners was only a few years. With hazards like coal dust, lead exposure, and cave-ins, it was a quick way to have your lifespan get completely rocked. Ah, jeez. Looks like Atticus is showing signs of a fever. And Pucus over there? He's earning his namesake. You ask your buddy Atlas what the heck's going on, to which he responds, looks like they all caught some sort of... No matter where you throw a dart on the board of history, diseases were always in the spotlight. Perhaps the most common in classical Greek times were smallpox, influenza, and measles. Luckily for you, your parents love you and got you vaccinated when you were just a wee babby, right? Of course, otherwise you'd look like this. But ancient Greeks weren't so lucky. It was pretty common for outbreaks to be spontaneous and run rampant, killing off people by the thousands. And what kind of disease discussion would it be without the mention of the plague? Yeah, the plague showed up in ancient Athens right around 430 BC, 10 years before you arrived. During that time, it eradicated between 75 to 100,000 people, or about a quarter of the city's population. The plague comes in 3 flavors: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, and strawberry. They're all basically the same thing, but affect you in different ways. Bubonic was the most common, as it's kind of stage 1 of the plague. Usually transferred from a flea giving you a little nibble, the plague is a bacterial infection that just penetrates your cells and fills them with toxins, killing them. This will also cause you to have a fever, the chills, and make you generally feel like shit. Your body will also start getting polluted with bumpy boils. If left untreated, the infection can spread to your blood, where it upgrades to septicemic plague. This is when parts of your body get the rot and start to turn black, causing severe pain as well as more frequent, unprovoked traffic stops. If the infection gets into your lungs, that's when it's classified as pneumonic plague. You begin coughing like crazy, and your respiratory system starts to fail. And that's no good. Luckily, doctors at the time relied less on the big guys in the sky for help and decided to take matters into their own hands, establishing and developing the concept of medical treatment. It was widely believed that the key to a healthy life was to consume healthy foods like fruits, veggies, nuts, meats, and dairy, not to mention plenty of exercise. Crazy thought, right? But if you did get the ick, there were a few solutions. The most common was bloodletting. Look, you're just a big walking blood sac, and since you're sick, that means you've got time to get rid of that. Thanks, Doc. I feel so... Other treatments were often natural remedies like herbs, soups, teas, and honey to heal your little stummy. But anyway, you're safe cause you're vaccinated, which means that you're the sole survivor of a recent outbreak, and you really like trains. Guess you're a free man now. Being very free and very man means that you now have access to education. Sorry ladies, you're gonna have to wait a while before you learn good. Time to hit the books. Now that your yearning for the mines is now a yearning for learning, it's time to trade your physical gains for mental ones. Ancient Greece had a wealth of educational resources including public and private schools, personal tutors, intellectual lectures, and a recent invention: books. Books started showing up around the 5th century. It was a great way to record down your stories and lectures without having to memorize them. But some pretentious Greek geeks like the famed philosopher Socrates believed that books would be the downfall of society, as people would just write things down rather than commit knowledge to memory. But imagine this: if you wanted to learn a story or a bit of information, you had to catch Rheticus on a Tuesday afternoon next to a fountain in the park, but you showed up a little bit late and missed half the story. Yeah, can you rewind like 10 minutes, please? Found a really good Euro spot. You want some? More for me. You attend several lectures and slowly learn to read and write the local dialect, Attic Greek. Not to be confused with Basement Greek. Although they were rare, you managed to find a small public library to see if there's anything interesting, when something catches your eye. Oh, no way. What the fuck? Like I said, I'd survive. If you've ever experienced the astronomical pain from stepping on a Lego, or the agonizing torment of waiting for a response after sending a risky text to someone you're about to find out has no interest in you, then you've experienced what true torture feels like. But people way back in the day were a little bit more sadistic when it comes to causing extremely unpleasant experiences. In fact, public torture and executions were something to look forward to. Yo Tom, I hear they're finally about to execute Jack the Jacker. You coming? No, but I bet he is. Anyway, I gotta go catch a movie with my third wife. Maybe next time. Catch a what? So anyway, here's 5 torture methods that you may not be familiar with. If you're not one to handle any kind of violence or blood or stuff like that, why did you even click this video? Well, I hope you're ready, because here we go. First, we have the pena collae, a form of Roman capital punishment which translates to the penalty of the sack. Now, before you get any ideas about someone being a brutal ball buster, this refers to an actual sack.
This punishment was handed out to those who were convicted of patricide, the act of offing your own dad. The individual would be bound and placed in a leather sack, but not alone. An assortment of animals included dogs, snakes, chickens, or even monkeys were placed in the sack with you. The sack was then sewn up and tossed into a body of water, so not only did you drown, but you were also getting absolutely demolished by panicking animals who were also going to drown. This punishment must have been quite popular as it had been used as far back as 100 BC up until the 1700s. The next method of torture showed that the English knew how to party. Designed in the early 1500s, the Scavengton's daughter, or the scavenger's daughter, served the opposite function as the famous rack. Nope, this rack. Instead of stretching the victim to look like a pool noodle, the scavenger's daughter compressed them until the ribs, chest, or spine dislocated. The goal of the device was not death, but simply to interrogate the victims, squeezing the truth as well as a couple organs out of them. The victim would be placed under an iron hoop which was able to be slowly compressed until the victim either confessed or died. It is said that the victims will often have blood shoot out of their ears and nostrils from the intense pressure. There is another device bearing the same name, but it operates under a different principle. The Spanish version, called La Scavenger's Daughter, worked by locking the victims in an excruciating and unnatural position, causing their joints to freeze up. But that can be quickly remedied with a few healthy stretches on the rack. Speaking of stretches, boy is this one a doozy. Take a look at this sucker. This is called the Pear of Anguish. What do you think it does? This bad boy right here, invented sometime around the 1600s, was theorized to also have been used as an extortion device, extracting confessions from victims. Leaving little to the imagination, the device is thought to have been inserted into the mouth, where it would be slowly opened, expanding the pear to the point of unhinging or breaking the jaw. There is also a possibility it may have been used in buttholes and hoo-has, though fortunately there is almost no evidence to support that this device was used in such a way. But to be fair, the Pear of Anguish looks like something you could buy off of Adam and Eve or at the back of a Spencer's. We're gonna move on to something a little less open-y. Ah yes, here we have the Heretic's Fork, a device that looks like someone forgot where they put their wrench. Yet this is another truth extractor. Apparently a lot of people lied back then, unlike today. Used mainly during the highly unexpected Spanish Inquisition by the loving and inclusive Catholic Church to seek out non-believers, the device was affixed between the jaw and the chests of many victims. Both ends of the fork were pronged. One end would pierce under the chin while the other pierced the sternum. The length of the fork was customized for each use, making sure that the victim's head was tilted all the way back full stop. The victim would be unable to speak or sleep without experiencing excruciating pain. Typically, the forks were inscribed with the phrase, "I recant," meaning that the victim was physically unable to recant. If you didn't confess, you were tortured in worse fashions and eventually executed. But if you did confess, you had the pleasure of still being tortured for being a filthy heretic. A real win-win there. The good news is that even though it was used hundreds of years ago, you can still buy one off of Amazon for one low payment of $44.99, so keep your chin up. Okay folks, last one. You having a good time? Yeah, you are. The execution method called Ling Chi has been used for over 1,000 years, which is appropriate because it's also known as the death by 1,000 cuts. Reserved for only the most heinous of crimes, this form of punishment was used in China from the year 900 up to the early 1900s. Generally, the guilty would be restrained on a wooden post with one or multiple executioners cutting into them, usually starting off with small, slow incisions to maximize suffering, and then continuing on to larger and more damaging cuts, sometimes even severing whole limbs toward the end. Unfortunately for the victim, the process was never fully well defined, and that was left up to improvisation. Historical recounts of Ling Chi state that executions could be as quick as 20 minutes or as long as 3 days. Not only was the permanent damage to the human body bad for the victim while they were alive, obviously, but it was also believed that the damage inflicted would carry on into the afterlife, condemning them to be sliced and diced as a spooky spirit. Huge bummer.
History facts that are wrong. This is probably one of the first things we all learned about in school when discussing ancient Egypt. Tens of thousands of slaves enduring endless hours of intense, forced physical labor while barely being fed or provided with adequate water. Drop a sack of sand, chisel something at the wrong angle, devout masochist, you're getting a whipping. Well, it's all poppycock. While there were slaves, they were mainly prisoners of war or household servants who tended to their landlords. but they weren't really part of the main labor force. Instead, laborers in ancient Egypt were conscripted using the corvée duty system, a way to pay off taxes through manual labor. According to the book The Pyramid Builders of Ancient Egypt, which discusses the pyramid builders of ancient Egypt, farmers were usually pulled from their laborious crop dusting for construction work whenever the Nile went all floody during the summer months. While the snobby rich upper class folk avoided manual labor by just paying off their tax burden, them smelly poors were tasked with construction of temples, tombs, and pyramids. Laborers who worked on the pyramids as well as other large structures way back in the ancient times were actually well provided for. This makes sense, as having a weakened labor force due to neglect or malnourishment, it doesn't really pay great dividends. Can't exactly move giant rocks when you're completely emaciated. Small villages have been discovered built specifically for housing laborers. These sites also contain various animal bones and plentiful bread jars showing a high quality diet. But of course, the system wasn't perfect. Thanks to some classic upper class corruption, sometimes things didn't always go right for these laborers, but they had the power to stand their ground. Dating all the way back to 1170 BC, written evidence has been found of an artisan's strike while constructing a tomb for then pharaoh Ramesses III. The artisans complained about a lack of promised rations and outright refused to continue their work, dropping their chisels and their hammers to march right up to the ruling class's temples to make their demands. What do we want? Food! When do we want it? Food! After chit-chatting with the local vizier, the workers were able to secure the rations and continued their work. Now don't get me wrong, the labor that these guys endured was backbreaking, extremely strenuous, and downright exhausting, but they weren't outright enslaved or mistreated, as historians previously thought. We've all heard the legends about King Tut's tomb, right? If you disturb an ancient king's burial grounds, you'll be cursed, doomed to die a horrible death. Well, it's not so. You'd probably cough a bit from inhaling millennia-old mummy powder, but that's about it. Now, there has been evidence of some ancient tombs inscribed with curse-like carvings. For example, ancient warlord and Egyptian noble Ankh-Tifi wrote that, quote, "Any ruler who shall do evil or wickedness to his coffin, may the gods not accept any goods he offers, and may his heir never inherit." Similarly, an inscription on the tomb of 10th century BC ruler Kentika Ikeki warns that any impure men who enter this tomb, there will be judgment. An end shall be made for him. I shall seize his neck like a bird, and I shall cast the fear of myself into him. Now, in a culture that was super superstitious, anyone coming across warnings like that would be like,
Oh shit! A ghost!
prompting them to 180 right out of the room. When King Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922, no such written reprimands or warnings were ever found. In reality, the rumor of King Tut's curse revolves around one George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a rich English white dude who funded the whole expedition that led to the discovery of the Sandy sarcophagus. He died a whole 4 months after the opening of the tomb. After which a journalist did what journalists do and printed a whole bunch of sensationalized fake news, attributing Lord Carnarvon's death to an inexplicable curse. To no surprise, the media ran with it, making claims of a written curse being uncovered with the tomb, though this never happened. So how did Lord Carnarvon die? He done got bit by a mosquito. The resulting bump was accidentally slashed while he was shaving, making a pretty nasty cut that later got infected. The old chap died of blood poisoning at the age of 56. Dedicated believers have tried to attribute other deaths to the curse, but they're really grasping for straws. Of the 58 people who were present at the opening of the tomb, only 8 had died within a dozen years of the discovery, and by various means ranging from cancer to murder to natural causes. The majority of the men went to live on full, healthy lives. At least they didn't steal any spooky slabs. That might have been a different story. When you think of Spartans, you probably think about them slippery, shiny hunks of warrior man meat as portrayed on the silver screen. A society of strict and viciously trained bloodthirsty warriors who could decimate any opposing army. But while you're thinking about oiled up, shirtless, muscular men, you might question if this portrayal is historically accurate. It's not. In reality, the Greek city-state of Sparta had no professional army. Although growing up with militaristic training, the purpose was not to create warriors, but perfected, hardened, and respectable citizens who could serve to defend their homeland if need be. That little element of perfection is where some rumors of Spartan eugenics come in. It is believed that ancient Spartans practiced infanticide, the act of killing deformed or undesired babies as a way to strengthen the Spartan society. However, the biggest downfall of this myth is that there's only one historical source that alludes to this barbaric practice, and it's this guy, Roman historian Plutarch. He wrote that Spartan elders would examine newborns for imperfections or weaknesses. Good, good, bad, good. What the?
Hello, Daddy.
Ew. If any were ever found, they would just yeetus the fetus off the Taygetus mountainside. This ensured that only the best of the best would be able to thrive to crushing adulthood. But this bit of literature is almost certainly a bunch of baloney. While historians can't confirm with 100% certainty, they can confirm with 99.9% certainty that this just flat out never happened. Excavations around the proposed baby hucking sites have failed to present any supporting evidence. There have been a few adult remains discovered, but no teeny tiny toddler tibias were ever among them. If you needed more convincing, Plutarch's writings date some 600 years after the height of Spartan civilization, so it might have just been some silly Spartan slander. That would be like if future archaeologists in the year 4000 unearthed fanfiction from today about how medieval Europeans would just shit their britches to ward off witches. Sure, it's questionable, but you could kind of see that happening, right? Despite what you may think, death was not the goal of gladiator battles in the Roman Colosseum. If it was, Rome would have run out of them real quick. Now keep in mind that the Colosseum was active for over 400 years, hosting a plethora of different events ranging from gladiator battles to public criminal executions to full-fledged naval battle reenactments with the entire Colosseum being flooded. Pretty wild, right? Well, gladiator battles were basically the equivalent of today's UFC or boxing matches, just with swords and spears instead of fists. These fights were spectacles of sport, and the gladiators were the athletes. You had some super famous gladiators, rookie gladiators, and everything in between. While some gladiators were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war fighting for their chance of freedom, most of the big old brutes fought for fame and fortune, or just the high-octane dopamine rush of being able to legally stab someone in the kidney and getting praised for it. Roman citizens were hyped to watch two dudes duke it out in a sweaty, sandy, sassy struggle of strength. But things were a lot more exciting than just the vanilla missionary position 9-to-5 white picket fence 1.5 children-ass sword and shield type gladiators. Nope. Actually, there were about 30 different types of gladiators ready to clang and bang away at each other. You had your dual-wielding Demochirus, the trident-chucking Retiarius, the silly-looking Caesar, and the alls-out, balls-out Cestus, among other DLC characters. So imagine that you're living your boring Roman life, sitting in your boring Roman house, scratching your boring Roman balls when you suddenly catch wind of the gladiator battle of the century. Two andabate pitted against each other. You'd lose your shit. Why would you lose your shit? Because andabate were condemned criminals fighting each other completely blind. Yeah, as a form of punishment, two criminals equipped with nothing more than a sealed helmet and a rusty sword were dumped out into the arena and forced to square off. It's like watching two blindfolded kids trying to whack at a piñata, except they're both potential piñatas. Now, while formal gladiator duels were not to the death, of course some still died, but it was more common to die by bleeding out after the match had been called by the referee. Oh yeah, they had referees. These were often retired gladiators tasked with making sure that the rules of battle were being followed and stopping fights before final blows were dealt. You see, gladiators were expensive investments, so their managers wanted them alive for as long as possible, lest they start all over leveling up another rookie from scratch. So with all that being said, professional gladiator battles were not performed for the sake of death, just for the thrill of the fight, and the potential of death. Ancient myths are tough for modern historians to interpret, as historical writers across time have their own biases. Depending on how they felt about a certain historical figure, they could cement their legacy in history as a smart fella or a fart smella. The prevailing myth that Roman Emperor Nero diddled his fiddle as Rome burned to the ground is one that should go up in smoke. It's commonly believed that Nero, having descended into madness over the course of his reign, started the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, a disastrous and destructive inferno that destroyed nearly 3/4 of the Roman capital. Accusations claim that Nero didn't really like the look of Rome and wanted to rebuild it in his own vision with a lavish and gaudy golden palace, so a conveniently timed fire would have been a great opportunity to do so. The fire is suspected to have started in a shopping district stockpiled with flammable goods. Once the fire started, it was nearly impossible to contain. Rome was a dense city, streets were narrow, housing structures were wooden, and the wind was a-blowin'. This set of conditions provided the perfect environment for the big ol' fire to really roar. The blaze lasted for 9 whole days, decimating 10 of Rome's 14 districts. But was Emperor Nero to blame? Not at all. According to Tacitus, one of the most influential Roman historians at the time, Nero was not near Rome when the fire started. He was actually several miles away in the coastal town of Antium, but he rushed back home to Rome once he caught wind of the disaster. When he did get back, Nero actually funded relief efforts and opened up private gardens and other structures for shelter to those affected. Despite these efforts, Nero still came under scrutiny from the nobles who hated him, claiming that he should have responded sooner and provided more assistance.
Freaking Nero, dude. I bet my scorched ass cheeks he started that fire himself.
Yeah, you're right, he probably did.
Guys, he was literally miles away in another city.
What did you do?
And that's how rumors start. In actual fact, there is no historical evidence that Nero started the fire, and especially no evidence that he played the fiddle when Rome burned, mostly because the fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 900 years. It's probable that the claim is part of Christian propaganda, as Nero famously blamed them for the fire, leading to their persecution. So who really got the last laugh? It was Nero. He burned a lot of Christians. It's possible that your middle school history textbooks may have toyed with the idea that ancient Aztecs, or even the greater Mexica people as a whole, saw the invading Spanish conquistadors as godlike figures. More specifically, history has suggested that the Aztec ruler Moctezuma, or Montezuma, however you want to pronounce it, believed that the arrival of the Spanish coincided with the prophesied return of Quetzalcoatl, the Mesoamerican feathered serpent god of creation. But we now know that it's all, as the Spanish say, a bunch of caca. It's certainly true that the native Mexican people were stunned and confused by the appearance of the foreign invaders with their fancy horses, gunpowder, and white skin, but there's no evidence explicitly stating that they were thought of as gods. Letters written by Hernan Cortés himself about his conquests never mention being mistaken for or being interpreted as a god in any way, shape, or form. And this is further supported by the writings of Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who chronicled Cortés's conquests in real time. One passage highlights a conversation between Cortés and Moctezuma in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Conversation basically had Moctezuma being like, yeah, people around here think I'm a god, that I'm all about gold and silver and precious stones, but look, you see that? Flesh and blood, my dude. We're both the same. I know that you're just a bunch of foreigners and not some otherworldly divine beings. That would just be silly. To which Cortés replied, so where did this idea come from? Well, it actually started to surface decades after the Aztecs were conquered. Publications of Spanish conquests alluded to the idea that Cortés and his men tried to pass their weapons off as magic and their horses off as intelligent, aggressive beasts. So it was mainly a sensationalized retelling of events, portraying the Mexica people as more feeble-minded, all while embellishing the Spanish image.
As it turns out, the Aztec weren't bamboozled by some distrustful deity. The Spanish completely steamrolled the Aztec with the help of guns, alliances to Aztec rivals, and every European explorer's iconic weapon, disease.
It was less, oh my god, and more,
Oh my god!
The Great Depression was truly a financial disaster, not only for the US, but for the entire globe. Most of you out there might recall learning that the stock market crash of 1929 caused the Great Depression, but in reality, it was just the signal that shit had hit the financial fan. Nothing more than a devastating effect from a much more threatening underlying cause. If you're unaware, the world economy is a constant struggle for balance of supply and demand, with price being the end result. Lots of demand and no supply, prices go up. Lots of supply but no buyers, prices go down. Sure, that's a bit oversimplified, but you get the idea. The Great Depression was a catastrophic chain of events stemming from US overproduction of goods. You see, in the early 1920s, the world had entered a time of peace at the end of World War I. This led to an industrial boom. Not for war machines, but for consumer goods. Mass production was going wild, and factories were farting out new products like crazy. To sell these products, companies began aggressive advertising campaigns. The news, radio, magazines, and everything just screamed in your face to buy the latest and greatest doohickey. And the people did. But how could customers afford all of this lavish spending?
Yup, the establishment of consumer credit.
Cars, appliances, clothes, homes, all purchased on credit. But the United States was not the only beneficiary of a peacetime economy. European and Asian markets began producing their own goods, selling these products to the US for cheaper prices, which caught the eyes of consumers looking to save a few pennies here and there. The big American companies, seeing potential profits leaving their grubby hands, were pissed and lobbied Congress to protect their interests. In order to do so, the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922 was passed. This raised American tariffs across the board, increasing the consumer cost of foreign goods as to thin out the competition and force Americans to buy American products. Europe and Asia promptly responded in kind, and soon a tariff war commenced. All this sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? Now, in order to keep a super long story super short, here's what happened next. Demand shrank as American companies and farms overproduced their goods. Too much stuff and no one to buy it means less sales. Less sales means less profit for these companies, and with less company profit, that means they're gonna start handing out some pink slips. With lots of people laid off, lots of people have less money to spend, so companies lose even more money, and if they lose enough of it, they go bankrupt. Now, when companies went bankrupt, at least back in the 1920s, the banks that supported them failed. And when the banks failed, people's money straight up vanished, thanks to the lack of FDIC insurance. Everyone loses their shit and rushes to withdraw money from whatever banks are still standing, but there's not enough physical cash to meet that demand. Now, all of a sudden, no one has money. So what happened to it all? The banks lent it out to all the rich people, placing speculative bets on the stock market. Now, when there's a lot of market speculation, stock market prices get unreasonably high. Unreasonably high prices aren't very sexy, so no one else wants to buy them. Instead, they sell to take profits. But when these profits are taken, that stock price drops. When stock prices drop, any remaining shareholders lose potential profit, which is no bueno. So they panic sell whatever shares they have. And when there's enough seller momentum across the board, the entire stock market crashes. So banks have failed, blue-collar workers have lost their life savings overnight, millionaires have lost their fortunes, factories have folded, and farmers have hung up their tools. Not only did this cripple the United States, but the entirety of global trade. The United States could not meet critical export demands, and foreign economies selling raw materials such as sugar, rubber, and lumber lost their biggest customer, and thus most of their money, impacting their economies. The Great Depression was without doubt one of the worst economic disasters of the modern age. The American economy struggled until the United States entered World War II in 1941, where demand for production and labor picked right back up. To put it simply, the 1929 stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. It was the writing on the wall that the system was breaking. Afterward, the banking system was overhauled and the stock market heavily regulated to prevent history from repeating itself. And we'll see how that goes.
Spooky history stories. If you're well versed in American history, then you know the story of formerly alive President Abraham Lincoln's big night out on the town in 1865. Even if you're familiar with the historical artwork around the matter, you might ask yourself, who the heck are these other people? You know Lincoln, sure, and of course the guy using Lincoln's skull as target practice is John Wilkes Booth. But also accompanying the president that night were his wife, Mary, close friend and Union Army Major Henry R. Rathbone, and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Lincoln and the gang were out celebrating the recent Union victory of the American Civil War and were seated in a private viewing box to the right of the stage in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. What do you think of the play, dear? Just then, Confederate sore loser John Wilkes Booth entered the booth and took aim, blasting the president point blank in the head with a .44 caliber lead ball from his single-shot Derringer pistol. At the sound of the gunshot, Rathbone spun around to see Lincoln collapse in his chair with Booth standing in a cloud of smoke. He immediately leapt from his seat and charged the assassin, but Booth came well prepared. In the struggle, Booth was able to equip a dagger and severely slash Rathbone's arm before leaping from the box onto the stage. Right before jumping, Rathbone was able to grab Booth's coat, causing Booth to lose his balance and eat shit, fudging up his leg in the process. Despite being in a packed theater of witnesses and bystanders, Booth evaded capture for 12 days. However, his plan was successful as President Lincoln died from his injuries just 9 hours after the fatal game of tag. Rathbone, who passed out due to blood loss but eventually recovered from his injuries, personally placed the weight of the president's death on his shoulders. He believed he should have been able to prevent the assassination, and because of this, he bore immeasurable guilt every day of his life, absolutely destroying his mental well-being to the point of insanity. After resigning from the military 5 years later, he struggled to find work until eventually given a consul position in Germany by President Arthur. Rathbone's now wife Clara had hoped that the change of scenery would do him some good. Rathbone's mental health continued to spiral, resulting in him lashing out at his young children and violently threatening Clara. After 13 years of mental deterioration, the breaking point had finally been reached. On December 23, 1883, Rathbone attacked his children in a fit of madness in their home. Clara had rushed to protect her children, but was fatally shot and stabbed by her husband. Instead of continuing his onslaught, he turned the knife on himself, stabbing himself in the chest 5 times. Despite the failed seppuku attempt, Rathbone survived his wounds, with police finding him covered in blood, claiming that there were people hidden in the walls of his home whispering to him. He was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife.
During trial, he was officially declared insane by court doctors and committed to an asylum where he died 28 years later. Henry Howard Holmes was an American con artist and the US's first documented serial killer. Born the lesser cool named Herman Mudgett, Holmes attended the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery in 1882, where he allegedly would accompany his professor in various grave robbing activities as a way to supply the school with fresh bodies for examination and dissection. It was here that Holmes developed a slight obsession with death, and seldom does such an obsession lead to good things. After graduating medical school in 1884 and being upgraded to Dr. H.H. Holmes, he moved out to Chicago to work in a drugstore, which he eventually bought outright from the owner.
What is drugs?
Proceeds from that store helped to fund his newfound hobby that would soon evolve into something much more sinister. Holmes drew up plans for a hotel, one designed to be a death trap for all who entered. Not the best business model for return customers, but hey. Several contractors and architects were put on the job with a steady rotation of firing and hiring. Now, it's believed that this constant turnover kept everyone from knowing his true design intentions, with no one designer knowing the full scale of the operation at any given time. When it was fully built, the hotel had 3 floors, with the first one being mainly retail and including a new drugstore. Holmes used the hotel to accommodate travelers during the upcoming Chicago World's Fair in 1893, which attracted millions of people to the area. Now, according to legend, the hotel contained secret rooms, trick hallways, and trapdoors and torture chambers throughout. It was in this hotel that Holmes would allegedly trap and torture his victims, eventually selling their bodies to the local medical school as a way to satisfy his macabre desires while still making bank. During the World's Fair, Holmes would charisma check dozens of wealthy women to spend the night in the hotel for rest and relaxation, but they would never be seen again. It is believed that as many as 50 women went missing during the World's Fair, all linked to what Holmes would later call his murder castle. In August of the same year, the 3rd floor of the hotel caught fire. While no one was injured, the fire destroyed most of the 3rd floor, but Holmes had an ace up his sleeve: multiple insurance policies. But, like insurance companies do, they refused to pay out and accused Holmes of setting the fire himself and engaging in insurance fraud. Holmes, obviously angered by such accusations, quickly skedaddled out of Chicago. And over the following years, he continued to dabble in insurance fraud with his friend Benjamin Pitezel. For his next trick, Holmes had suffocated Pitezel with chloroform and burned his unconscious body for a life insurance payout. What's even worse is that through extreme coercion and manipulation, Holmes had convinced Pitezel's widowed wife to place 3 of her 5 children into his custody. And over the years, he would murder all 3. Holmes had forced the 2 older children, 13-year-old Alice and 9-year-old Nellie, into a trunk, drilled a hole through it, and plugged it with a gas line, suffocating them. He then buried their bodies in a cellar in his house. As for the 3rd child, 7-year-old Howard, Holmes drugged the boy, dismembered, and burned his body, with only some teeth and bones being the identifying factors. Eventually, the children's remains were discovered, leading to Holmes' arrest and subsequent conviction of the Pitezel murders. He was sentenced to death and hanged in 1896, but not before confessing to over 200 murders thanks to his murder castle. But Holmes was regarded as a habitual liar, and experts believe that there was only enough evidence to link him to 9 murders. Still a high count, but not nearly the 200 that Holmes had claimed. As for the murder castle, it is confirmed that the stories about the design and the use of the building were widely sensationalized and over-exaggerated by local media. Sucks from a horror standpoint, but still makes a good story nonetheless, right? Take a look at this face. Seem familiar at all? If not, then you're useless to me if I start joking. Anyway, this is a death mask, a plaster casting of the face of an unidentified woman who was pulled from the River Seine in Paris in the late 1880s. She became known as L'Inconnue de la Seine, or the unknown woman of the Seine. After being fished out of the French River, her body was placed in the Paris morgue, which, at the time, put nameless corpses on full display for the sake of identification by the general public who happened to be passing by. Oh hey kids, look, it's Grandma! Because of this strange but effective method, the morgue became a popular tourist and public gathering spot, often referred to as the only free theater in Paris. This particular woman, however, was a bit of an oddity. Medical examination showed no visible wounds or signs of a struggle, so it was concluded that her death was self-inflicted, with her age being estimated at just 16 years old. But it was her calm, serene expression that caught the attention of a pathologist at the morgue. Since he couldn't take a picture to make it last longer, he decided to instead cast a plaster death mask of her face as a way to immortalize her. Creepily enough, but also to no surprise, many Parisians thought that having a face of a dead woman in their house to be the coolest thing since sliced baguette.
Sacre bleu!
So countless copies of the death mask were made. From an artistic standpoint, many interpretations claim that the young woman's demeanor expresses a calm control over death, being accepting of its inevitability rather than fear. From a non-artistic viewpoint, you have some dead girl's face hanging on your wall. Over the years, her face had inspired several literary works, pieces of art, and even fashion. But where have you seen her face before? Well, believe it or not, chances are you've actually unknowingly given her mouth to mouth. Because hers is the face of the CPR training doll, which is used in almost all CPR training courses worldwide since 1960. Sure, that might be creepy, but at least it's thematically appropriate. World War I was absolutely brutal. It was the forefront of many new innovations in warfare like tanks, heavy machine guns, and manned aircraft. All effective technologies developed for the sake of boosting your own kill count. But another, more sinister tactic was soon deployed onto the battlefield: chemical weapons. Perhaps the most widely used was mustard gas, but others were used too. For instance, chlorine gas, a yellow-green gas which sure enough looks like a stereotypical funny fart cloud, but packs a lethal punch. This story begins in September of 1914, where German soldiers were tasked with taking the Russian-occupied Auschwitz fortress. It was constructed as a Russian Empire border defensive structure against German attack, and boy was it good at its job. German Empire units had repeatedly tried to penetrate the fortress, but were told no through heavy retaliatory gunfire and artillery. Despite facing multiple defeats, stubborn German soldiers refused to give up so easily. 3 assaults were conducted on the fortress over the course of a year. The first saw German infantry losses of about 6,000, while Russian forces only suffered 139. The second assault saw a continued bombardment on the fortress by German artillery, but the Russian soldiers didn't budge. This caused several month-long standoffs, which eventually resulted in German retreat. However, the third assault was to be the one to huff and puff and blow the fortress down. Returning to the fortress in August of 1915, the German forces now had fresh soldiers, even heavier artillery, and multiple canisters of chlorine gas. On the defensive side, the Russian line was only 900 strong, but they still took their chances against the impossible odds. After waiting several hours for favorable wind conditions, German soldiers bombarded the fortress with the deadly gas to flush out the enemy. The Russian soldiers, unfortunately, had no suitable protection against the gas and had to improvise, covering their faces with the best thing that they could come up with: rags soaked in piss. To no surprise, this proved ineffective. The soldiers were severely incapacitated by the gas, and now they smelled like piss. As a quick science lesson, when chlorine gas is inhaled, it reacts with the residual moisture in your body, forming hydrochloric acid, which starts to corrode your internal organs. In short, it causes big ouchies on the inside. With this mechanism of action being well known, the Germans were certain of their victory and began to infiltrate the fortress, but were met with a horrific sight. Despite suffering in complete agony, covered in blisters and coughing up lungs and blood, the Russian soldiers still stood their ground and continued fighting. The German troops, of course, scheißed their Hosen at the sight of the seemingly undead Russians and fled from the fortress in a complete panic, with some even stumbling into barbed wire in the process. The rest of the German troops immediately hightailed it out of there. Although successful, most of the Russian defense died from the gas. Those who did survive barely got by the skin of their whatever they had left. Sadly, Russian troops preemptively demolished most of the fortress as Germans began closing in for a 4th time later that month. Just as a quick warning, I'm going to be showing some graphic medical photos of real syphilis patients, so if you don't want to see that, click away now. There you go. Usually when you hear the phrase Italian Renaissance, you think of high-class society, revolutionary innovation, and lots of statues of dudes with their dicks out. Well, allow me to throw a wrench in that perception by introducing you to the concept of syphilis zombies. Syphilis? Like the guy with the boulder? No, silly. Syphilis. Like the STD. Quick backstory. In 1494, the King of Naples, Ferdinand I, died of butthole cancer. If his name sounds familiar, it's because he's one of those evil kings that I covered in a previous video, so you can check that out if you haven't. Wink. Anyway, Ferdy's son Alfonso II took his daddy's throne but was quickly put in a state of check by French King Guy Charles VIII, who claimed that he had claim to the throne because of his noble Angevin bloodline. Or so he claimed. Little Alfonso was like, well, how about you just take Milan instead? Your lawn? No, Milan. Well, why would I want your lawn? I hate mowing. Are you serious right now? After some clarification, King Charles agreed, and with 30-some thousand soldiers, invaded Italy, took over Milan, but felt unsatisfied. Oh sweet, Charles took Milan. Oh, he's heading this way too. Why is he heading this way? Naples was also taken. With such a successful campaign through the peninsula, the French army, which consisted of Spanish, Swiss, Flemish, and even Italian soldiers, decided to celebrate. And you bet your sweet balls that meant women and alcohol were involved in medically inadvisable quantities. When you have a bunch of people from all over Europe quite literally come together in one city, there's gonna be some interesting results. This one was syphilis. Actually, it was kind of like a super syphilis, as historians generally agree that the strain that went around was much more severe than its modern cousin that we are more familiar with. That is the rhetorical we, of course. This meant that the disease was much more contagious with symptoms that were much more severe. Since it was the Renaissance, let me paint you a picture of how it all went down. Your first step is finishing up your very consensual physical time slot with a local woman of the night. During your bi-weekly wash, you notice something around your own peninsula. You have genital ulcers, small open wounds forming around your tender meat log. But that worry is quickly put to rest as you develop a bad fever, multiple rashes, and muscle pain. Get used to that because you're gonna be like that for a few months. As you continue to live your now much more miserable life, you discover the formation of big, stinky, painful sores and abscesses across your body. These sores start to penetrate deeper and deeper into your tissue until your flesh quite literally rots to the bone. The bacteria eats away at your skin, your eyes, your nose, and your lips. You don't die just yet, but you wish you would. For months or even years, piece by piece, you fall apart, with chunks of your body just sliding right off. Got your nose. Thousands of people were walking around like this day in and day out. Eventually, the soldiers were expelled from Italy and returned to their respective homes. Within a few years, syphilis ran rampant through most of Europe, and by 1520, the so-called French disease infected Africa and Asia as well.
Imagine that you're a poor simple peasant farmer in the mid-14th century. The only skills you know are plowing and sowing seeds, not only in the field but also with your unbathed wife, resulting in 3 starving, freeloading children. How cute. Pat, pat, pat. You're in the middle of your daily farm run when suddenly your neighbor approaches and leans down to your dusty son, blasting an entire sneeze into his open mouth and walking away without a word. Congratulations, your family is now the host of something called the plague. Little do you know, your entire life is about to change for the worse, or for the better depending on how much you actually care for your son. In the year 1346, a big storm was a-brewing in the east. Residents of China, India, Turkey, and Palestine were feeling a bit under the weather. So far under the weather, in fact, that they ended up 6 feet under the ground. Because they died. Believed to have originated from Central Asia, the bacterial infection known today as the bubonic plague, or Black Plague, began spreading like the plague. Accelerating through heavily used trade routes, it did not take long to extend its reach. The infection was initially only transmitted through bites of fleas piggybacking off of rats. But you could also get it through direct contact with infected tissue, or by having a friendly neighbor sneeze into your mouth. The rapid spread and swiftness of death caused major panic. With mortality rates as high as 60%, people were seeing friends and family quickly evolve from being alive to not alive in a matter of a few days. Even though death was quick, getting there was not so pretty. A physician residing in Spain published his first-hand accounts of the effects of the plague on his fellow humans. For the sake of not sounding like an uncultured idiot, I will not attempt to pronounce his name, but here it is. However, I do know that these are 2 characters from the hit Disney film Aladdin. No, not that one. Yeah, the good one. Anyway, he states that an infection would begin with a rising fever that left patients disoriented and depressed. They would then go on to experience a plethora of excruciating symptoms that you usually hear about at the end of a prescription drug commercial. Consult your town's spooky doctor if you have experienced the Black Plague. Plague may appear in adults ages 0 to 112 and may cause an increase in cramps, coldness in the extremities, frequent vomiting, skin lesions, chest tightness, difficulty breathing, spitting up blood, stinging chest pain, inflammation, intense thirst, coughing, blackness of tongue, swelling of the throat, abscesses, difficulty or impossibility of swallowing, headaches, fainting fits, dizziness, nausea, and foul-smelling diarrhea. If any of these symptoms worsen, it is most likely too late for you. Black Plague is not for everyone, but everyone you know will get it. So yeah, getting the plague sucked. And to make matters worse, many doctors back then were about as qualified in medicine as a TikTok comment section. So they just looked at their infected patients and went, huh, that's weird. Try draining all your blood. Oh, that didn't work? Well, let's rub some herbs in it. Yeah, that's nice. Oh, I'm such a good doctor. And of course, if your doctors couldn't help, then there was only one other place you could really turn to. Not surprisingly, religion really wasn't that much help either. Some of the more hardcore religious nuts believed that they absolutely deserved the plague for being such naughty boys, so they did a little thing called self-flagellation, or the act of beating the ever-loving Christ out of yourself. The practice was so popular that even the Pope at the time, Pope Clement VI, came out and said,
"Stop it. Get some help."
And so they did. Instead, they simply resorted to placing the blame of the plague on minority groups. Some smarter folks began a more effective practice called common sense, where they would simply avoid other people who they suspected to be infected. Italy even took a step further, forcing ships arriving from infected ports to sit offshore for up to 40 days, or a quarantena, which is where the word quarantine comes from. Of course, there were larger consequences experienced by the severe loss of life. Across Europe and Asia, the available labor force crumbled and trade routes halted, with landlords desperate for workers. With no smelly peasants to harvest crops, food shortages were the norm, with prices hyperinflating on what scarce food remained. Eventually though, through continued quarantines and improved hygienic practices, the Black Plague did subside in 1351. It did poke its head in from time to time over the following centuries, but it wasn't nearly as bad. In the end, from 1347 to 1351, an estimated 25 to 75 million people died from the plague, the majority being impoverished laborers and peasants. But there was still hope for the absolute chatiths who survived. As I mentioned, landowners were desperate for workers, and with such high demand with such little supply, they were required to pay laborers a much prettier penny for their work. If their landlords refused to pay more, workers now had the freedom to tell them to frig off since other landlords needed workers as well. Suddenly, peasants were zooming by in their low-riding 1-horsepower tricked-out Mustangs and moving up in the social ranks, with some becoming artists, musicians, and influencers. Furthermore, the sheer amount of death inspired people to appreciate the finer things in life, focusing on themselves instead of religious figures, with the birth of humanism. Inspiration evolved into deeper scientific curiosity as medical professionals wished to learn more about what just killed all of their friends. Society was quickly realizing the fragility of human life and sought a way to better themselves through increased interaction, sharing of ideas, artistic expression, and scientific ingenuity. If the Black Plague has taught us anything, it's that a majority of society needs to be swiftly erased before all of the really cool stuff starts happening. But that sounds like something a dictator would say.
Something bad about every US state, in no particular order. Hawaii is our most recent state added to the Big 50 in 1959. The US government had their eyeballs all over the little group of islands as a strategic military outpost in the 1800s. Not to mention the sugarcane plantations. Freedom forbid any smelly European or Asian countries get their grubby paws on it, so with that in mind, as well as wanting to circumvent any potential sugar tariffs, a couple of US businessmen with a couple of US Marines pointed a couple of their US guns at Hawaiian King Kalakaua in 1887, forcing him to sign over power to the United States. But after the king Kame his last hame, his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, tried to regain power, but the US was all, ha! So one cuckoo kachu later, and the Republic of Hawaii was established in 1894, led by one Sanford Dole, whose cousin would go on to form the Hawaiian Pineapple Company, which would later become the Dole Food Company. If you've never had it, Dole Whip is freaking amazing. Highly recommend it. Ground zero for the 1918 influenza pandemic, the deadliest pandemic of the modern world, is widely believed to have been Camp Funston in Manhattan, Kansas. The camp itself was an army base training infantry in the closing months of World War I. Well, with failure to quarantine sick troops, the flu was definitely not just in Kansas anymore. Sickly soldiers were sent overseas where they oversneezed in Europe, spreading the flu worldwide. By the end of the pandemic around 1921, roughly 500 million people around the globe had been infected, with death toll estimates ranging from 50 to 100 million poor souls. July 16, 1945 saw the detonation of the world's first nuclear weapon at the Trinity nuclear testing site in the Jornada del Muerto desert in New Mexico. The successful detonation was the catalyst for the construction of the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan towards the end of World War II. It's just a shame that thousands of New Mexico locals were never warned about the testing because they caught some heavy radiation dosages. Between the years of 1948 and 1975, the Aberdeen Proving Ground facility in Aberdeen, Maryland, hosted a wealth of unethical human experiments on U.S. Army soldiers. About 7,000 soldiers were experimented on, all without informed consent, meaning that they had no idea what they were getting into. The men were exposed to over 250 different chemical weapons, including mustard gas, deadly nerve agents, and psychoactive substances for the sake of researching effects, preventative measures, and medical treatments. Despite the lethality of some of these substances, dosages were low enough where no deaths were reported. These are getting dark really quick. So here's a silly one. The Aroostook War of 1838 was a bloodless armed standoff between American and British-Canadian lumberjacks. While they slept all night and worked all day, there was a disagreement about where the US-Canadian border actually was. So both sides, eager to chop into the Aroostook River Valley's supple, sappy trees, got into a bit of a kerfuffle. Troops were deployed, but no shots were fired and no lives were lost. Instead, everyone skipped and jumped home to cut down trees on their respective sides. The 1974 super outbreak was one of the most intense tornado outbreaks in recorded history, with 147 separate tornadoes formed in a 25-hour period across 13 states, with Indiana being hit the hardest. 47 fatalities, 1,000 injuries, and hundreds of millions of dollars in damages were reported. That blows. Just slightly west of Virginia is West Virginia, home to the worst mining disaster in the history of the United States, so far. On December 6, 1907, the Fairmont Coal Company's number 6 and number 8 mine shafts in the town of Monongah went kablooey. 2 separate methane explosions instantly killed hundreds of workers in the mines and trapped any of those fortunate enough to survive, but their luck quickly ran out. The combined blast collapsed most of the existing cave structure and the ventilation shaft, blocking off fresh air and building up toxic gases which suffocated the trapped miners. The lack of any safety standards or respiratory safety equipment made rescue attempts hopeless. Only 5 men managed to be saved, with 362 lives lost. The tragedy sparked public outcry for stricter safety standards, and in 1910, the US government established the Bureau of Mines with the goal of reducing mining accidents, though it had been a few decades before any safety standards would be enforced. Bet you don't yearn for the mines anymore, do you? In 1879, members of the Osage Native tribe struck oil on their reservation. The US government did what it does and quickly swooped in to establish oil production and paid out royalties to the members of the Osage tribe, catapulting them to astronomical levels of wealth. And that's when the mysterious deaths started. You see, Congress, not believing that the natives were capable of managing their wealth by themselves, appointed American businessmen and lawyers to look after their finances as legal guardians. Well, throughout the 1920s, some of these guardians began the systematic murder of 60 Osage natives in order to inherit their wealth. Formal investigations were launched, becoming one of the first major investigations conducted by the FBI. If you want to read more about this, I highly recommend the book Killers of the Flower Moon. There was also a film adaptation done recently, but it apparently wasn't as good. Louisiana. In the early 1900s, there was a plethora of invasive water hyacinths just gunking up the local rivers. Not to mention a pervasive meat shortage. So in order to feed 2 birds with 1 stone, the American Hippo Bill was proposed to Congress. The bill would import African hippos to munch on the plants, only for said hippos to be subsequently munched on by Americans. Other animals were on the list, including Manchurian pigs, African buffalo, Tibetan yaks, rhinos, and of course, dicks. Sadly, the bill never passed, thwarting American plans to deep throat delicious and nutritious dick meat. A series of massive earthquakes completely rocked southeast Missouri in 1811. One 8.0 magnitude earthquake was so severe that it caused sections of the Mississippi River to flow backwards and several parts of the surrounding landscape to go all bleh. Some people died, probably. On April 12, 1861, those gosh dang Confederates bombarded Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina for 34 hours straight and 0 hours gay, marking the start of the United States Civil War, which would go on to claim the lives of nearly 700,000 people. The worst massacre in US history involving a school dates all the way back to 1927 in the small town of Bath, Michigan. Local disgruntled douche Andrew Kehoe used dynamite to destroy the Bath Consolidated School, an expensive upgrade to the local school district. The construction and maintenance of the school caused local property taxes to shoot up to account for operating costs. Kehoe, who was already on edge from his failing farming and political careers, as well as a terminally ill wife, had hit a breaking point with the steeper tax burden. Over the course of several months, Kehoe had managed to purchase multiple crates of dynamite, something typically used in farming at the time for stump and boulder removal, and hid them throughout the school. On the morning of May 18, 1927, the dynamite was detonated, killing 38 in the process and injuring dozens more. While the chaos ensued, Kehoe had murdered his wife, destroyed his own farm, and drove to the school with his truck packed with more dynamite. He parked his car in front of the school and detonated the truck, taking himself and a few bystanders out with him. Luckily though, a second hoard of dynamite within the school failed to detonate, preventing further loss of life. This single tragedy had claimed a quarter of the town's children. California, the United States' sweaty ass crack, boasts the largest economy in the country, which is perfect, because that's what they need to constantly fund relief efforts for the thousands of wildfires each year burning millions of acres. In 2020 alone, California saw over 9,600 wildfires with almost 4.4 million acres reduced to char. Do better. Get wetter. Extremely heavy and frequent rainfall in 1926 through 1927 culminated in the Great Mississippi River Flood of 1927. The big ol' river traveled across the land, flooding far and wide through several states including Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, and of course, Mississippi. Around 500 souls were washed away and several hundred thousands of people were displaced from their homes, resulting in upwards of $10 billion in damages. The US-Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota resulted in the largest public execution in United States history. The people of the Dakota Native American tribe were pretty darn pissed as incoming settlers sought to manifest their destiny across the Midwest. After constant displacement and being on the brink of starvation due to poor farming and hunting conditions, the Dakota had just about enough. A small group of Dakota men had attacked and killed 5 settlers, including a man, his wife, and their teenage daughter. This escalated into a small uprising which was stomped out by the US Volunteer Army over the course of about a month and a half. Over 350 US civilians were massacred, with 150 Dakota natives killed in the clash. After all was said and done, 400 Dakota men faced trial, with 303 sentenced to death, though President Lincoln did reduce this down to just 38 men sentenced for execution. These men received their short drop and a sudden stop in front of a public crowd on December 26, 1862. Since 2007, over 20 detached and decayed human feet had been washed ashore along the coast of the Salish Sea in northeastern Washington. The feet had been found in various shoes, supposedly protected from additional predation from scavengers. Several of the feet have been identified as remains of missing people or those suspected of ending their own life within the area. Pretty sad, but hey, free shoes. In perhaps the worst lapse of judgment in the history of mankind, the city of Cleveland, Ohio organized Balloon Fest in 1986. The goal of the event was to break a world record of most balloons released simultaneously, but I guess no one realized that balloons don't rise in perpetuity. Shortly after the release of over 1.5 million inflatables, a storm system promptly blew the elastic spheres back to Earth, blanketing the city and polluting Lake Erie. Airplanes were grounded, fishermen went missing, waterways became clogged, and many lawsuits were issued. All in all, the cleanup cost the city of Cleveland over $5 million. The people of Oregon really hate it when you pronounce it as Oregon, so I've experienced. But anyway, a few months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a single Japanese pilot flew a secret mission to bomb the forests of Oregon in an attempt to divert war supplies. Incendiary bombs were dropped in the forests of Brookings, but in terms of damage, they didn't do jack shit.
Thanks.
After the war, the Japanese pilot, Nobuo Fujita, was invited back to Brookings as a guest of honor in order to make amends, which he hesitantly accepted. As a formal apology for his actions, Fujita presented the city his family heirloom katana, one passed down across 400 years, which is still on display in the Chetco Public Library to this day. Timothy Treadwell was a huge fan of wild grizzly bears. Keyword being was. He spent about 13 summers living amongst them in Alaska. Returning one final time towards the end of autumn, the bears then became a huge fan of Timothy. One giant grizzly had attacked Timothy and his girlfriend, mauling and eating the couple. The bear was later shot and killed, with an autopsy confirming human remains in its stomach. Fellas, don't befriend giant wild animals. I don't care how cute their ears are. They're wild animals. They will murder you. North Carolina almost became No Carolina in 1961 after a B-52 bomber carrying a payload of 2 nuclear bombs headed towards the Canadian Arctic experienced a catastrophic failure and broke up mid-air shortly after takeoff. The destroyed aircraft unintentionally dropped the bombs back down to Earth, with one falling from the plane as if properly deployed, initiating a sequence of safety switches for detonation. However, one final safety switch failed to actuate, saving North Carolina and a few surrounding states from becoming nothing more than a big black smudge on the globe. The other bomb slammed into the earth, but very luckily remained intact and relatively undamaged. Both bombs were rated as 3.8 megaton bombs, about 250 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. So yeah, the US almost accidentally nuked itself into oblivion. During the events of World War II, tens of thousands of Japanese Americans were relocated to several internment camps across the country out of fear of domestic attacks. One such camp was the Heart Mountain Camp in Park County, Wyoming, which housed 14,000 Japanese Americans during its 3 years of operation between 1942 and 1945. The camp boasted many activities, a poorly supplied school for children, a hospital, and many sports and social clubs, but, they were still forced to be there and heavily monitored. Way back before the US was even established, the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia was formed in 1607. Just a few years later, settlers experienced what is known as the starving time. The combined effects of the brutal winter of 1609, food shortages, devastating disease, and constant Native American attacks really screwed over colonists who resorted to pure desperation for survival. The colonists ate dogs, rats, their own shoes, and each other in order to survive. 300 settlers saw the beginning of winter, but only 60 saw the beginning of spring. The state of Rhode Island saw around 1,000 slaving voyages between the 18th and 19th century, bringing in an estimated 100,000 slaves to the Americas. The year 1919 saw the occurrence of the Elaine Massacre in Hoopsburg, Arkansas. About 100 African American sharecroppers demanded fairer pricing for their cotton crops as they were frequently underpaid for their labors. During a meeting, which was protected by armed guards, 2 white men rolled up to find out what all the hullabaloo was about. After a brief struggle, some shots were fired, though it's unknown who shot first. One of the men died, the other injured. Well, word got out about the event being a supposed uprising being planned by the black community. In response, several locals and hundreds of US troops were deployed to put an end to the so-called rebellion, resulting in the cold-blooded murder of over 200 African Americans in the area. In 1903, residents of Van Meter, Iowa reported sightings of a strange bat-like humanoid figure for several nights. Dubbed the Van Meter Visitor, the bat-human-dinosaur hybrid monster thing possessed big ol' flappy wings, sharp claws, and an eerily glowing horn on its melon. Many credible witnesses attest to the sightings, and locals, in true American fashion, shot at the creature in an attempt to kill it. It supposedly escaped into a nearby abandoned mine and was never seen again. In the early 1800s, Colonel William H. Jackson once gifted his favorite oak tree its own deed, legally entitling it to its own ownership and all land within an 8-foot radius of itself. The original tree, located in Athens, Georgia, fell in 1942, but not before an acorn sprouted a new sapling, which legally inherited the land. Why is this bad? That's because there's a chance that this tree owns more land than you do. The Bonneville Salt Flats in northwestern Utah look like something out of a dream sequence. Back in the 1920s, with the evolving technology of automobiles, adrenaline junkies would often challenge each other to travel across the flats as fast as possible. Of course, this inevitably led to numerous crashes, breakdowns, and deaths, a tradition that persists to this day. The Silk Strike of 1913 in Paterson, New Jersey was the organized strike of over 25,000 silk workers with the goal of establishing an 8-hour workday and better working conditions. Over the course of the strike's 5-month duration, 300 silk mills had shut down with no workforce, and over 1,800 strikers were arrested for inciting violence. Ultimately, the strike was defeated as influence failed to spread beyond Paterson and no demands were ever met. Speaking of terrible working conditions, the Radium Girls of Ottawa, Illinois were tasked with hand-painting watches with self-luminous paint made from radioactive powdered radium. The women would often point their brushes with their lips to produce finer tips, but their lips inadvertently sipped the radioactive drips, and if one dared to skip the lip tip grip, their managers would flip, so tips remained dipped and their lips remained zipped. Company owners expressed the safety of the material, but actively avoided it themselves. The ingestion of the radium, unsurprisingly, caused multiple women to contract radiation poisoning. Between the years of 1917 and 1927, over 50 women had died from acute radiation syndrome. This sparked public outrage and reforms in labor rights. Radium continued to be used in the production of watch dials up to the 1970s. Multiple residents outside of Exeter, New Hampshire all reported seeing the same strange light pattern in the sky across several evenings in 1965. The large object reportedly moved silently across the night sky, emitting eerie red lights in a specific pattern. The event terrified locals in the area for years, though skeptics have debunked this event as simply a mid-air refueling drill performed by the United States Air Force. Specifically, KC-97 tankers flashed red lights in the same exact pattern that was described by eyewitnesses. The city of Wilmington, Delaware experienced a catastrophic outbreak of cholera and typhoid fever in the late 1800s thanks to rapid industrialization shitifying up the local water sources. With hundreds sick and dozens dying, the city had to drastically overhaul the local sewer system, including installing a water purification plant in the early 1900s. But at least you can breathe a fresh sigh of relief nowadays. This is a devil's hole pupfish, a critically endangered and supremely cute species of fish found only in the Devil's Hole in the Death Valley National Park in Nevada. Or Nevada for the locals. The fish were first discovered back in the 1940s and were almost immediately attempted to be protected. In 1967, they were officially listed as endangered thanks to local drilling by development companies, which reduced water levels within the cave system. Despite aggressive conservation efforts, there were only 38 of the little guys in existence as of spring 2025, making them one of the most critically endangered species on Earth. The Great Jacksonville Fire of 1901 completely reshaped the city of Jacksonville, Florida. After a rogue kitchen fire broke out, the flames quickly spread to a nearby mattress factory. After more than 8 hours, the inferno finally came under control after completely engulfing the majority of the city, destroying almost 2,400 buildings in the process, rendering 10,000 people homeless and 7 people dead. Now that's what I call a fire sale. Farmers in the late 1960s and early 1970s were pretty pissed to find their precious moo cows slaughtered and mutilated beyond natural means. Investigations clocked in over 8,000 separate mutilations over the years. Some of the bulbous bovines were found to have sedatives in their systems, while others were secretly marked with fluorescent paint. Unidentified aircraft in the area were spotted, suggesting government interventions or possible secret weapons testing, but no conclusive evidence was ever found. 19th century Philadelphia, Pennsylvania saw the rise of several teeth thieves who would go around robbing graves of entire bodies. The corpses would be sold to nearby medical schools for anatomical study, while the teeth were extracted and sold to companies who made dentures. Remember to smile. Kentucky is home to the McCoy family, one half of the infamous Hatfield-McCoy family feud. Initial squabbles began in the 1870s over the Civil War, with the Hatfields being Confederate sympathizers and the McCoys being pro-Union. Across 30 years, multiple lawsuits, thefts, and even murders escalated the feud, with over a dozen family members killed. The feud finally came to an end in the late 1890s. Or did it? About 100 years after the start of it all, descendants of the families came together to duke it out on the game show Family Feud in 1979, with the McCoys coming out on top. Nowadays, the family homes are tourist attractions, holding annual festivals with activities like tug-of-war and sight tours to commemorate the decades-long dispute. Just north of South Dakota is North Dakota, and boy did it suffer a harsh winter in 1936. Record low temperatures plummeted all the way down to negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's negative 51°C for you foreigners. The frigid forecast froze farm fauna fleeing for favorable feverishness. Entire towns burned through their coal supplies, leaving families to die in their homes from exposure. In 1847, nearly 200 Dutch immigrants made their way over from the Netherlands to Wisconsin in search of a better life, but a similar cold climate. After months of crossing the Atlantic and scooting in through to the Great Lakes, the freaky-deaky Dutch were just about to set foot in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, when a poorly maintained boiler overheated, causing a fire to erupt on board the very wooden ship. Unfortunately, the ship only had 2 lifeboats, capable of holding about 20 people each. Of the few hundred people aboard, only 45 managed to escape on the lifeboats. The Phoenix, ironically, went down in a blaze, never to rise from the ashes, because they were washed away. Mysterious deaths surrounding the Ray family had caused concern for the townsfolk of Jewett City, Connecticut. The supposedly healthy family members were stricken down left and right from an undetectable killer. The boys of the family became paler by the day and were seen coughing up blood until ultimately passing away within the coming days. The reasonable cause of death, the townsfolk thought, was vampires. In order to stop the undead from rising and killing others, the recently deceased were exhumed from their graves and burned. The real culprit? Tuberculosis. Conveniently enough, though, the burning of the corpses probably did prevent the contagious disease from spreading any further. Go figure. In 1855, the US government approved the import of several camels to serve as pack animals through the arid landscape of the Southwest, formally establishing the United States Camel Corps. But then the Civil War broke out a few years later in 1861, and the camels were either sold off or completely abandoned in the desert, supposedly being spotted over the next several decades. Roam free, fellas. Boston, Massachusetts is home to the deadliest nightclub fire in US history. The Coconut Grove fire burned itself into people's memories in 1942 with a wealth of poor safety choices leading to the brutal blaze. Exit doors were chained up to prevent unauthorized access, air conditioners were filled with flammable refrigerants, and everyone was packed in like sardines. Not to mention the fact that all of the lavish interior decor could catch fire faster than a witch in Salem. In all, 492 people ended up dying in the inferno. The club owner, Barney Wolanski, who was very much aware of his club's safety code violations, was convicted on just 19 counts of manslaughter and was sentenced to just 15 years in prison, though he was pardoned after just 4. He ended up dying a few weeks after release from cancer. Now, when you're chilling in class, the last thing you want to experience is a big old gas explosion. But unfortunately, the students in the New London School in New London, Texas, were about to do just that. Alright class, who could tell me what happens when you hook a big chunk of magnesium into some water? Yep, Ron. That's an easy one. It just, after recently canceling their natural gas supply contract to save a few buckaroos, the school board decided to instead tap into a local gasoline waste line to supplement the demand. The shitty and shoddy plumbing work caused natural gas leaks throughout the school's basement crawl spaces. Now keep in mind that natural gas is colorless and odorless, so no one was really aware of any leaks, except for the students who complained of headaches, though they were ignored by the staff.
You get out of here, go on, get.
The creeping gas cloud was inadvertently ignited on March 18, 1937, causing an instantaneous explosion that killed 295 out of roughly 500 students and staff present in the building. The disaster led to a reform of requiring odorous additives to be added to natural gas supplies for better detection of leaks. If you're looking for a breath of fresh air, New York City is probably not the best place to do so, especially in 1966. The Great New York City smog blanketed the Big Apple in a giant fart cloud of carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and smoke. The dense haze persisted for 3 days across the 1966 Thanksgiving weekend. A public health study estimated that about 10% of the city's population suffered some adverse health effects from sucking in the smelly smog. In the end, 168 New Yorkers ended up biting the dust, prompting President Lyndon B. Johnson and several members of Congress to produce the 1967 Air Quality Act and amendments to the 1970 Clean Air Act, which heavily reduced air pollution down to more manageable levels of toxicity. In the wake of the US Civil War, the South was really hurting for some cheap labor as all of their slaves were just freed thanks to the 13th Amendment. The best alternative? Prisoners. Convicts were extremely cheap compared to full-time employees, so in the early 1890s, Coal Creek mine owners decided to lay off their workforce and instead conscripted convicted criminals to work the mines for pennies on the dollar. But instead of milling around, the recently sacked and salty miners decided to pick a fight, sparking the Coal Creek War of 1891. The manic miners attacked a load of state prisons and mining properties, ensuring their efforts would not be in vain. The National Guard was called in, arresting over 500 workers. The scuffle did result in Tennessee ending their convict leasing program in 1896, so that's a win. Sweet Home Alabama is home to Yellow Mama, an electric chair built in 1927 by master carpenter and inmate Ed Mason. 152 criminals have gotten the sweet, stinging embrace of Yellow Mama's arms, with her final zap being performed in 2002. Since then, death row inmates were given the legal right to choose their demise, either lethal injection or the chair, and to no surprise, they opt for the less painful option. As such, Yellow Mama remains locked away in the attic of the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, patiently waiting for her next victim. Imagine your life as a beaver, munching away on a tree or building a dam, when all of a sudden you get yoinked away from your beaver family, put in a tiny box, flown up to the sky, and hucked out of an airplane to be parachuted down miles away from home. That's exactly what the Idaho Department of Fish and Game did in 1948 after locals complained of excessive property damage. 76 beavers were relocated from northwest Idaho to central Idaho via airdrop using leftover World War II parachutes. One beaver died. Very sad. A big-ass swarm of locusts tore across the Midwest in 1874, devastating any and all vegetation, food, clothes, and farming equipment for days on end, with Nebraska taking most of the damage. Water sources were contaminated and livestock were consumed. High estimates place the swarm size at upwards of 12.5 trillion locusts. I mean, there were quite literally a blanket of locusts a foot high off the ground. The swarm, spanning across 2 million square miles, reportedly blocked out the sun for multiple hours during their flight. By the time the locust plague had passed, the Midwest had sustained over $200 million in crop damages. Bennington Triangle, located across southwestern Vermont, saw several people disappear under mysterious circumstances between 1945 and 1950. The most well-known case being the disappearance of 18-year-old student Paula Jean Weldon, who up and vanished in 1946 and was never seen again. The young girl had reportedly left her college campus in the afternoon and proceeded to walk 6 miles to a nearby trail before going missing. Lack of substantial police investigation, evidence, or witnesses left the case cold. The poorly run investigation had prompted the Vermont legislature to create the Vermont State Police just 7 months after Paula Jean's disappearance. Hundreds of Lakota Sioux natives were gunned down during the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 after natives began expressing frustration and anger over continued forced relocation and broken promises from the US government. You suck! A new religious movement called the Ghost Dance, a literal dance performed in hopes of ridding the land of white settlers, was seen as a potential act of rebellion.
That's scary, I don't like that.
As a precaution, natives were rounded up and disarmed by the US Army. A misunderstanding surrounding an accidental misfire of a rifle started the massacre, which saw the murder of about 300 native men, women, and children.
Continuing that pattern, Montana had itself one of the worst Native American massacres in US history. The Marias Massacre involved the cold-blooded murder of over 200 Piegan Blackfeet Native Americans, all gunned down by the United States Army near the Marias River in Montana. The whole conflict escalated from years of back-and-forth petty skirmishes, white settlers encroaching on native lands, and Blackfeet natives raiding these new settlements. But all came to a climax on the morning of January 23, 1870, where a large force of US cavalrymen gunned down over 200 Blackfoot natives. Since most of the men were out hunting at the time, the majority of the victims were elders, women, and children.